by and large, chapters 3 and chapter 4. Financial analysis, so I'll try to keep it down to 2 questions so you'll have time to actually work on it and focus in on the 2 problems. So financial analysis of something, some security, some financial situation, and then a project analysis. So like a chapter 3 type question and then chapter 4 type question. And then we'll start talking about the Income Tax Act a little later on this week and see how that affects everything that we've been talking about up until now. So let's get back to replacement analysis here. This is unlike the previous example where we had a new let's say equipment with new technology that brings something new to the table that we may want to exploit in our company. In that situation, we had equipment that was working really well, and vendors are coming up with something great and new, and the question is it worth spending the money right now to replace what's perfectly working well right now? This is slightly different in that it's a like-for-like comparison. There's actually no new technology around. It's just same old. But what we've got right now is wear and out. So it's got costs that are higher as a result of it basically breaking down a lot and high maintenance costs. And this is really when we're talking about economic life, the economic life analysis. So there's a trade-off here. The longer we keep something, the lower the capital recovery cost. The longer we keep it, the more it costs to maintain. And so where do we draw the balance between the 2? That's what this analysis is about. So what I'd like to do is just start out with a sort of a simple example and look at it for keeping this piece of equipment for 6 years, then generalize it to n years and see how things play out the longer that we keep it. And indeed, you'll see a curve that has a minimum total cost. Because what are we after? We're after the total cost of ownership. And the 2 components are capital recovery and operating maintenance. So this example here, piece of equipment that costs $1,000, and just for the time being, I'm going to say that the end of the life on this equipment, it has no value, just to make the numbers easy. But of course, the salvage value is a function of the longer that we keep it, right? It's a decreasing function. If I trade things in every year, salvage value is going to be high. If I keep it 10 years, it's going to be low. So really, salvage value in your general case is S, salvage value, a function of N, the number of years that we keep the asset. And then we've got operating maintenance costs, O&M, operating maintenance, that typically increase each year. And it costs a money of 8%. I'm going to define a term, the equivalent uniform annual cost. Let's turn everything into an end-of-year cost. And that will allow us to directly compare all of these alternatives. That's the trick to doing this type of problem, is looking at it from a equivalent uniform annual cost basis. That makes it directly comparable, which is what we want. So let's have a look at keeping this piece of equipment for 6 years. Well, we buy it. And by assumption, no salvage value 6 years from now, and we have an increasing set of costs. Okay. Well, if I want to turn that into an end-of-period uniform series, or uniform annual cost, easiest way is to take the net present value of all of that, and then essentially annualize it. Bring it forward 6 years in terms of end-of-period cash flows. So hopefully by now everyone's familiar with NPV and these formulas that we've been talking about. And so I get a negative $3,114 cost. So think about that as being NPV 6. What's the cost of running this thing for 6 years? And if I want to convert that now into an EUAC, minus sign there is simply, we're talking about cost now. So if I say, what's the cash flow associated with my lunch this afternoon? Well, it's minus $12. What did it cost me? $12. I'll cancel the minus one. Okay. So the EUAC is a positive number because it's the cost, despite it representing a negative cash flow. So 3114 spread over 6 years using time value money at 8%, equivalent 674. Okay. And so it costs the equivalent of $674 to keep the machine for 6 years. And that then we'll see whether or not that it makes any sense in terms of keeping it 3, 4, 5, or whatever. Let's generalize it. So if I say I'm going to keep it for n years, where n is an integer, then the uniform cost is essentially going to be, well, this A given P against the actual cost of the machine is just the capital recovery, right? And then I'm saying, well, let me find the present value of maintenance and spread it out over n years. Okay, pretty straightforward. Let's look and see how we might generalize that. Well, I'm going to make, I'm going to do some sort of arm movement here in terms of just deriving these formulas. Because that's going to get me into, see those swirly brackets aren't projecting correctly again. Oh well. Okay, so what am I doing? Well, I want to get an expression for EUAC that looks like something we've seen before. Okay? And that equation up there doesn't lend itself to that, because that's just a direct expression of the cost. Well, let me say, first of all, that A given P and P given A are reciprocals, right? Present value, future value are reciprocals. So if I take, if I have an annuity, turn it into present value, and then take that present value and turn it back into annuity, I get the same number, right? So it's 1. Similarly, if I have a gradient series and I turn it into a present value, and then take that present value and turn it into an annuity, well, I get an annuity based on the gradient. Okay. So I can basically condense the red terms and the green terms into something that looks very much like capital recovery plus operating maintenance. Okay. So that first term is the capital recovery. Because remember, our formula for capital recovery is simply the first cost, A given T, I comma N, and then if we have a salvage value, it helps reduce the cost, right? So I'm going to get A given I comma N, okay, where S now is a function of N. The longer I keep it, the less the salvage value is worth. Well, really what I've got there is this part, because I've assumed S of N is equal to 0. Now remember what that means. That is the cost associated per year of the loss of value of the machine for N years, the N period that I'm keeping it, plus the interest on the money I've got tied up in that machine. So it truly is the fully found cost of having that machine. And then to that, I add operating maintenance. Well, if you can see that, operating maintenance is now an annualized version, right? Because 150 was what it was costing me, the base each year. And then I've taken that escalation factor and turned that into an annuity as well. Right, so I've got that gradient going up by 135. A given G just levels that into a constant number each year. So what I've got here for EUAC is capital recovery plus the annual operating maintenance cost. And that then seems to make some sense. What are the two components of having the machine? Well, capital recovery and operating and maintaining it. Okay. And again, S of N is a decreasing function. Assume it's 0 here to make life easy. Okay. Well, let's see how this plays out now as a function of N. And we would hopefully see something that looks familiar. Well, here what I've done is calculated the EUAC for each integer from 1 to 10. Okay? And I added up the sum of capital recovery plus operating maintenance to give us the total cost of EUAC. And as expected, the longer that we keep it, the more it costs to operate and maintain per year. And the longer we keep it, the lower the capital recovery costs. You know, trading it every 10 years is going to cost you a fraction of trading it every year. Sum them up, and what you see is that the EUAC, the total cost of having this machine in our company, goes down, hits the minimum, and then comes back up. And so from this analysis, and we'll be a graph in a sec, N equals 4, and we say 4 is the economic life. Because if I keep it any longer, it's going to cost me more. If I trade it in any more frequently, it's going to cost me more. So the economic life of this asset is 4 years. And it minimizes the cost of 6 at a time. Now, I just want to talk about why this works and give you a sense of why we're doing it this way. So let's try to explain the most sort of confusing number to perhaps that 1230. Where does that 1230 come from? Well, it suggests that the cost per year of keeping the machine 1 year, trading it in, zero salvage value admittedly, is 1230. Well, look at it this way. If I have N equals 1, what are my cash flows? Well, I'm going to buy the machine, and I'm going to keep it for 1 year. And that 1 year is going to cost me $250. Okay. But what I want to do for direct comparison purposes is to have something that's at the end of the year. And we'll show you why that works in a second. So what I want to say is, what's that equivalent to? That is the basis for my direct comparison against all the other alternatives. Well, hopefully everyone's comfortable with doing that right now, and that's 1,000, that's given C, 8% comma 1, plus 150. That's 1080. Plus 150 is 1230. Hopefully that number up there. Okay. So think about what this means. If I buy the machine, I have an equivalent end of year cost of 1230. Okay. What do I have to do now at the end of year one? Well, I got to buy another machine because I'm trading it in every year. Well, what does that give rise to? Same thing. And at the end of year two, what do I need to do? Buy another machine. So think about it from this point of view, in that it keeps on going as long as we're in business, because I need this machine. That gives rise to an end of year cost of 1230, which hopefully you'll agree will go on for a long time. Now, why have I done it that way? Well, I want to directly compare it to the next option, holding it for 2 years, which we're arguing is cheaper. Well, what happens if I keep it for 2? Well, N equals 2 looks like that. Minus 150 and 285. Okay. So I'm going to buy it, keep it for 2 years, run it for 2 years, and get hit with these two sets of operating and maintenance costs. Well, let me do the same sort of thing, and hopefully you'll see exactly why I want to do it this way. Well, if I want to get an annualized version of that, the easiest thing to do is the net present value. Okay. So let me do the net present value of that. Okay, bring it all to end of year 0. Okay. And let's see, that is, I'm not going to do the calculation, 1383. Okay. So simply bring these three cash flows to here, and then bring it forward to 2 time periods, in other words, a uniform series. So take this 1383 and say, I want A given P 8% on the 2. Okay. And that number is 776. Okay. Which is that number right there. So what does that mean? It means if I buy end of year 0, it's going to give rise to equivalent cost 776. Okay. That's one cycle. But what happens 2 years from now? Well, don't I have to buy another machine? And I'm going to run it for 2 more years. Doesn't that give rise to the same thing? And the third cycle, I think you get the idea. So for as long as I need this machine, replacing it every 2 years gives me a $776 per year cost. So this is why we do it this way, because now it's directly comparable. Keep it 1 year, it costs me $1230. Keep it 2 years, $776. Direct apples to apples comparison. And so if I do it for 4, which I'm not going to do on the board, I find that it's 641, which is the cheapest. So the key thing here is finding a structure within which I can compare directly. Because I can't simply do NPV of 1 or NPV of 2, because that's, that's basically running it 1 year versus 2 years. That isn't the right comparison. Okay. So EUAC here is 641, implies an economic life of 4 years, which then means if I'm using this piece of equipment in an engineering project, I'm going to have a 4-year planning period. Okay, that's the key thing. Well, let's have a look at the graph. Okay. Well, I think I've talked before about that trade-off, and indeed it's playing out. The longer I keep it, the less the capital recovery. Operating maintenance, I mean, it's not generally not linear like this, but it increases the longer I keep the machine. Think about an automobile, and keeping it for 9 to 10 years, and how much maintenance costs. Same thing. And so the sum of the two, that EUAC, where I'm taking interest into account, has a minimum around 4. What I can see is, the actual, well, Chapter 4 answer is 641 because it's minimum. If I know what some intangible factors, I want to say, well, less work is preferred to more work, and it's really not that sensitive in terms of 3, 4, 5, or 6. So perhaps there's the intangible thing about, changing this machine that's not factored in every 4 years, and I can get away with doing it every 6. It's really not that much more expensive. So, the economic answer is 4, but a practical answer is probably somewhere between 3 and 6. in that the cost really won't change that much. Sometimes it does come down and go back up much more quickly. Okay. So it's not particularly sensitive to the length of ownership. It's pretty easy to say anywhere from 3 to 6%. Okay. So that's the EUAC type of analysis. Any questions? Okay. I have 2 examples I want to talk about. Maybe I'll just go to the board right now because it falls onto that, which hopefully will sort of tie together everything we've talked about in chapters 3 and 4. Okay. One of the things that you have to strategize about in a problem is consider what's the planning period. And I'm going to suggest that the nature of the problem, affects how you do that. This is a lighting example, okay? And we're all interested in energy efficiency and carbon footprints and all of that. But in the end, a lot of it boils down to economics. And so this is lighting replacement. So it's a lighting replacement project. And this company has cost of capital for minimum attractive rate of return of 10%. Cost of money. And there are 2 options. There is a 5-year bulb. So it has an expected life of 5 years. And it costs $20. And in electricity costs $19 per year. Okay. So one of the more expensive energy efficient bulbs. And I have a 2-year bulb that I can buy. It only costs $1. But the electricity costs are higher, $28 per year. Okay. So if I'm looking at one bulb, of course I'm not going to think about it. But I'm the factory manager here, and I've got 1,000 bulbs in the factory. Do I go to the boss and ask for $20,000 for new lighting in, or do I just out of my own budget replace them all at $1 a piece? It costs me $1,000. Okay. Well, issue is there good return on that money? Now, if I'm an environmentalist, what's the answer? What do you think? Second choice? Okay.
Actually, the objective. Yeah.
They don't like any option. Oh, that's even better. Okay. Well, for the rest of it, I wouldn't give that answer on a quiz. Let me just share that advice with you. Okay. Okay. So here, of course, our footprint is less, and well, there's less garbage. We're not throwing this away every 2 years, every 5. Okay. Now, an environmentalist may not even want an economic assessment because it may turn out that it really makes no sense in terms of spending that money if we're beholden to our shareholders at a 10% rate of return. Okay. And we'll talk a little later on once we talk about taxation, about how governments can influence companies to make the right decision. And there's tax incentives, accelerated depreciation, a number of techniques that can be used to get people to do the right thing. But by and large, you're measuring this investment based on rate of return. And there's an extra $19,000 in my factory that I come up with and have to justify. Okay. At New College, we've actually spending a little more money than we should when we're going to a floor on a dorm. We're putting nothing in now but LED lighting, simply because it does cost us less in electricity. But when we do the analysis, it's more for intangible reasons. Our students want us to do it rather than financial reasons, because the electricity that we save doesn't justify, spending like $50 or $60 for a bulb that I can buy for 5 or 6. So there's intangible factor there. But anyway, we're doing it. Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem? Well, first of all, let's ask the question in terms of planning period. Let's say this is, we'll start here. Okay. Let's say this is like the University of Toronto. We're going to be around for a long time. Okay. And we can take a long-term view. So let's say long-term view. Okay. In other words, we have a factory, we own it, we plan on being there for a long time. as opposed to, let's say, leasing the factory and knowing that the lease is gonna end, let's say, 7 years from now, and we're gonna get new premises. So we're gonna be around for a long time. Cool. Now, we've suggested to you that net present value always gives you the right answer. Okay. So why don't I just do this? Net present value of the 5-year option, and that's a number. Net present value of the 2-year option, and that's a number. And choose the lowest number. What's the cost? And he always gives you the right answer. It's not the same, right? This is keeping the factory lit up for 2 years. This is keeping it lit for 5. Doesn't make any sense comparing the two. This presumably is always going to be cheaper, especially since it's a cheap bulb. So this is not the way to do it. What about if I do it this way? Let me say, what's the cost of both options? So here we get into what we call least common multiple, LCM. Okay. In other words, I can do 2 cycles of this and assess the cost. I can do 5 cycles of this, assess the cost. Either way, I've got the cost of keeping the factory lit for the next 10 years, and I can choose the cheapest. Okay. So this is one way of doing it. Okay. Somewhat tedious because you have to repeat this thing 5 times. But what about if we say, well, if we're going to be here for a long time, why not just minimize the annual cost of lighting the factory, which allows us to use an EUAC approach. Okay. And so the way we might want to look at it is to say, and think about as we're working through these numbers, what's the assumption? Where does this break down? Well, if I look at now the 5-year bulb, well, what am I doing? I'm spending $20. I'm doing a capital recovery, A given P, 10%, 5. Assume the bulbs aren't worth anything at the end of 5 years, we throw them out. And my electricity costs are at the end of the year, just by assumption. I get a $19 bill for electricity at the end of the year, even though I get it monthly, but we do things end of year most of the time. So my cost of per year, if I buy this bulb and run it for 5 years, is $24.28. Similarly, I can directly compare that because I'm doing an end of year cost. So I take a $1 bulb, I spread it out, and now I've got higher electricity costs, 28. Okay. And so that's going to be, I'll put per year, and that's going to be $28.58 per year. Okay. So for once, and it's unique, the environmental choice happens to be the least cost option. It doesn't happen to be. Please.
For the present, given present value for the second one, is it the year?
Thank you. Thank you.
The UAC doesn't.
Because I'm spreading the bulb over 2 years. Perfect. Okay. Sometimes in the States, the people are watching, well, not that much. Okay. So we're going to replace. Now, why did I need to take the long-term view? Or where does this thing break down? What's implicit in this calculation? What do you think?
That the cost will be the same in the long run.
Okay, that the cost will stay the same in the long run. Okay. Remember, usually this is a real cost of capital, and therefore the inflationary part. But you're quite right. Energy efficient bulbs might become more cheaper over time, right? And these things, if demand stops, will become more expensive. Okay, so over time, but let's say for the next cycle or two, probably not a bad approximation. But what's implicit in this calculation?
We're actually spreading the $20 over 5 years.
Over the 5 years, right? And so what happens if I'm not in the factory for 5 years? Right? Why is it worthwhile? Well, I'm taking 5 years worth of energy savings and using that to pay for the more expensive bulb. So if I truncate this after 2 years, I've got this bulb, which is now costing me a fortune, but I've only got 2 years worth of energy savings. So probably it makes no sense. And so if I now say, let me ask the question, well, what's keeping it for 2? EUAC for 2, well, for both of them, well, this one already is done, right? Sorry, this one here is for 2. But what about if I keep the 5-year bulb for 2? Well, then I'm saying I'm going to spread that expensive bulb cost out over 2 years, and I get 2 years worth of electricity saved. If I do that, as expected, it's not worth doing because I'm not getting enough savings in electricity to justify that very expensive bulb. Okay. So again, this says if I have a planning period of 2 years, okay, then I can't spread the cost out and use 5 years worth of electricity savings to pay for that bulb. Okay. So the key thing here about this long-term view is that we're around in this factory long enough to, by and large, have the entire cycle of 5 years and 2 years basically come to an end, so that I can indeed spread out the cost over 5 years. So let's say, if I'm in the factory for, let's say, 22 years. Okay. Well, I suggest that the error is not going to be that great, assuming everything stays the same over time, because what's the difference? Well, here, over 22 years, I'm going to have 11 exact cycles of this and be done. Whereas here, I'm going to have 2 cycles, and then 2 years of the bulb, and 3 sort of being wasted. But what's the present value of that error? 11, 12 years from now. Very low. Okay. So if I'm in for the long term, I can make a reasonable assumption that I'm going to keep these bulbs for their entire lives, and therefore do realize that trade-off between energy savings and more expensive bulbs. Please.
If we're gonna progress like that, do we start in year 1 or year 0?
When you say graph?
Yeah, like the left side, like we change it to annuality with
Okay.
every year.
So what I'm doing, let me see, what am I doing? I'm doing, I'm buying this for $20, let's say, and I'm keeping it for the 5-year bulb, right?
Right.
So 19. So I'm taking this set of cash flows, okay, and actually this should be closer to 20, okay, and I'm turning it into end of year 1, 2, because that's what the annuity formula does. Okay, and then that allows me to directly compare against that, because, well, one cycle is this, repeat the cycle is that, repeat the cycle, but then I've got one more, but I'm going to be in the factory for a long time, so I'm just going to continue. Okay. So when there is a difference, because the thing actually truncates, it's a long time out from now, and the present value of that error is small. Okay. So I can reliably use the sort of criteria. What is the cheapest cost per year of lighting the factory? And I can use the EUAC function. Okay. Well, let's say now that we are not going to be in the factory for a very long period of time, but a definite period of time. So part of your strategy in looking at these problems is essentially deciding on the planning period. And the first piece of advice is, well, I've got the economic life of the asset to deal with. But of course, if I'm not going to be around to take that entire economic life into account, then I need to do some truncation. So let's say the second is a definite planning period. So in other words, I'm leasing this factory, and I'm going to be gone in 7 years. Well, hopefully, if I do it this approach, you'll agree that I will not have necessarily the right answer because of this. Right? Because 5 years from now, I'm going to be, if I continue with a cheap bulb, or sort of the expensive bulb, I'm going to only have it for 2 years, and I'm only going to get 2 years worth of savings. Therefore, it's probably not the thing I want to do. Okay. So in this case, I have to very specifically look at the 2 alternatives. I can't do an EUAC because I'm not guaranteed that I can keep the asset for the entire life. Now, I think initially we proved that for the first cycle, the expensive bulb, the energy savings bulb, is worth solving. So let's look at 2 options. One is a 5 and a 5. Okay. In other words, I want to keep the factory lit for the next 7 years. Well, what's a 5 and a 5 look like? Well, I'm going to buy the bulb, for 20 bucks. I'm going to run it for 5 years. I'm going to buy another bulb, and I'm going to run it, and I'm done. Right? Because someone else. So someone else is going to be in the factory and benefit from the lower energy costs as a result of us having spent money on this. Okay, well, what's the net present value of this? Net present value, okay, and now this is a negative number because it's just the present value of those cash flows, right? And these, of course, are 19. Is going to be minus 124.92. The other alternative is to recognize that it's not worth spending all of this money, and we have an option here of a 2-year bulb. Well, why don't I compare that to 5 plus 2? Well, then what do I have? Well, the first cycle, then I buy a really cheap bulb and 2 years worth of higher electricity costs. Right? So these become 28. This is $1, and these are 19. Yes, 19. Okay. And so here, replace with with 2 years. Well, an NPV analysis here suggests that minus 122. As expected, it makes no sense to buy this expensive bulb if you're only going to get 2 years worth of income savings. The difference isn't as great as that might suggest because it's 5 years out. But nonetheless, it is cheaper to go with the 5 and 2. Is it the environmentally right thing to do? Well, the answer is no. So what do we do? Yeah, please.
First 2 years and then 5 years.
Probably that would be higher because this option costs more than this option per year. I haven't done it, but my guess would be that it would be a lot. Yeah, because we're putting off the higher costs till later. So the present value of those costs are less. So I think you always want to take immediate savings if you can, if it's time value money. But good point, yeah. So I think if I put these two, if I went the 2-year bulb first, that's going to be a higher cost. I'm almost sure. Yeah, but the trade-off is a more costly option, so I think it would weigh more heavily into time value money. Okay. So what do I want to do if I want to do the environmentally friendly thing? Well, I want to put in an expensive light bulb here. So maybe I might negotiate with the landlord, the person that owns the actual factory, and say, well, why don't you help pay for this bulb? Because you're going to be able to sell or lease the premises much more easily because there's less electricity costs. So what we may want to do is sort of trade off in terms of this expense so that the right thing can be done and the costs are shared. Presumably it's easier to sell the place if the electricity costs are that much cheaper in terms of lighting. The lease comes up annual and the landlord is looking for another customer. That's one way here. And of course the assumption is that all the light bulbs don't burn out at the same time, so that when you leave 2 years from now, if this factory's not shut. Or you have to you have to leave the premises in the way that you basically got them, which is light bulbs working. So if they all did burn out, then you needed another dollar here. But it doesn't happen. They just aren't as bright anymore. Okay. So again, key thing here is looking at the planning period, often tied to the economic life of the asset, and then deciding whether or not simply minimizing the cost per year, if you're there for a long time, that oftentimes is a very valid approach, or if there's a definite planning period when you actually are going to be out of the premises, or you've got a piece of equipment that you have to truncate in terms of salvage value, then you have to do this one. But there are 2 ways of doing it. Okay. Got one more example I want to share with you. And this is an internal rate of return question which hopefully ties together many things that we've talked about up until now. I have two projects. And right now, they have, and again, we do everything at the end of the year. And if I look at their cash flows, they look something like this. And I have an economic life. So in this option, I have this. And an economic life of 4 years. And in this option, it's more expensive. I have this. And I have an economic life of 1 year. Okay. The company uses the internal rate of return method to evaluate projects. The company has an MARR of 10%. Now, I want to make the right recommendation, not just the answer that comes out of the IRR method. Right? And those two can possibly be different. So when I look at this project, normally what we do is we have a constant dollar approach, which means that we've taken inflation out of the cash flow. Right? We go back to the inflation discussion of chapter 3. Which then means when we have a cost of capital, where we're going to value this, it's the real cost of capital. In other words, no inflation. It's not the actual cost of money to this company. It's the one that's been adjusted for inflation. And if you remember a formula, D equals I plus J plus IJ, okay, where I is real, J is inflation, and D is actual. When we're doing engineering economic problems, it's the I that is our king. If we take all of the inflation out of the problem. So if I have to renew equipment, I can do so at the same cost at the, that doesn't look right, does it? Sorry. We always start at end, here's 0. That's better. And so we basically can renew our plant at the same price because inflation is taken out of it. So first of all, we want to be able to provide service for 4 years. Okay. And so you got to choose a planning period. And probably 4 years is a good choice because A lasts for 4 years. Remember, that's the economic life. That's the period, holding period for it that minimizes the EUAC. And we have the ability to renew the equipment in Plant B, or in Project B, annually. So first thing is planning period. And it's 4 years. Okay. I have to provide service, so what am I going to do? Well, at the end of year 1, I'm going to buy the machine again. Similarly, okay. And in year 4, of course, I don't have to buy it, the project's over. So for a 4-year project, obviously if I have a 1-year machine, I've got to buy it 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And I can buy it for $9,500 each year, simply because there's no inflation in this problem. I'm using a constant dollar approach. Okay. So these are my cash flows. Okay. Now, in terms of the problem itself, I'm going to have to decide how to approach it. But again, part of your strategy is in terms of the interrelationship between the alternatives. Okay. What can possibly happen? Well, there's four possibilities. There's 4 alternatives. Okay. Do nothing. I can do A, I can do B, or I can do AB. So 4 permutations of this particular analysis. Now, which ones are feasible? Well, it depends on the constraints that you're going to be given. Now, what about if I don't talk about constraints yet, and talk about how we might approach that depending on the different relationships between these alternatives. If they're independent projects, remember, we're using IRR here, and I can basically calculate the IRR of each and choose all where IRR is greater than 10%. Okay. So in the absence of information about A and B, all 4 of those are feasible. So in other words, if both of them are less than 10%, then I do nothing. If both of them are above, I do both, because they're independent. Okay. Now, what about if they're mutually exclusive? Well, in that case, I only need one, right? Because they're competing alternatives to do the same thing. Okay, so here, I guess I can say 1 through 4 are eligible. Here, only 1 through 3, because I don't need both of them. Don't need 2 accounting systems. Now here, I've got a problem. I need to look at things, if I'm using IRR, on an incremental basis. And we talked a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings of reinvestment and cash flows and why simply taking the IRR of each of these alternatives, if they're mutually exclusive, might be misleading. Yes, you may get the right answer, but you're not guaranteed. And on a test, getting the right answer is not nearly as important as doing it correctly. Okay. So incremental basis, we'll talk about that in a second. And so what about now if I have a mandatory project? Well, the mandatory, if someone's forcing me to do it, usually means it's mutually exclusive as well. Right? If I have a pollution control system, I don't need to choose. So mandatory usually means mutually exclusive. Okay. And therefore, the only options that are viable are 2 and 3. Okay. Which would minimize the work. So let's now define the constraints on A and B. Okay. A and B are mutually exclusive. So now the problem will tell you the relationship between the 2. So now for this problem, A and B are mutually exclusive, but not mandatory. Okay. Therefore, options mutually exclusive but not mandatory means I can do nothing. So 1, 2, and 3 are the alternatives that might be interesting. Okay. So let's now talk a little bit about how I actually go about evaluating the IRR. And then I'll get you to have a look at it for next day. So let's build a decision tree to help us decide what to do. And the goal of this decision tree is to make sure that we always get the proper recommendation, where the proper recommendation is the project that maximizes the value for the contribution to the company. Not the one with the highest internal rate of return, which may not be the highest value project measured with NPV. So let's have a look and see how we might do that. Well, I'm going to start off, first of all, the approach is to rank projects in terms of spending. And spending is just simply end of year $0. Okay. Well, I've got 3 projects here, 3 alternatives. Do nothing is $0. 2 is 76. That's A. And the other one is, what is it, 95. Okay. And as I suggested to you Incremental approach starts with the cheapest project and then sees whether or not that invested capital makes any sense. So the cheapest project here is do nothing. Doesn't cost anything. Okay. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to compare do nothing with the next most cheapest option, which is A. Well, do nothing, A minus do nothing is really A by itself, since do nothing has no benefits and no costs. Right. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to determine the IRR of A. And what can happen? Well, three things can happen. I'm going to assume the way IRR exactly equal to MAR doesn't happen. It's either less or greater than. If the IRR is less than MARR, one thing can happen. Or if the IRR is greater than. Okay. Well, and of course, equal to won't happen. Okay. Well, what does this tell us? Here, it tells us that spending $7,600 has a return less than 10%. Not worth doing. Therefore, the winner of this first comparison is do nothing. Is there anything else I can do? Well, yeah, I've got another alternative, which costs $9,500, which I can test. So if I go down this side of the tree, I'm going to say A is not worth doing. B is the winner. I'm going to do B versus do nothing, which is B by itself. And I'm going to ask the question, IRRB. And it can either be less than or greater than. Let's go down this side of the tree. This side of the tree says that A is worth doing. But I still have one option to consider. But given that A is worth doing, I need to ask the question, is it worth spending the additional money on B for the additional benefits that I'm going to get? The notion of each invested chunk of capital has to return greater than MARR or the project is worthwhile. So given that A is worth doing and B is the next most costly option, I'm going to ask the question B minus A. Okay. Now, it is always very, very important to have this is the more dollar one minus both fewer dollars. You're solving something against 0, and therefore you're going to get exactly the same answer. But if you do it the wrong way, you're going to get the exact opposite recommendation. You're asking the question, I'm spending more money. What's the return on that? As opposed to saying, I'm spending less money, and what are the savings on it? So, more dollars minus fewer dollars in terms of end of year 0 spending. Well, what can happen? Is greater than IRR. B minus A is less than. Okay. And if you have an option 4, then of course you're down one more level. So all of these things can happen, and then you have to decide what to do with your fourth, more expensive option than $9,500. But we've only got 3 options to consider. So think about what the recommendation is going to be based on going down the tree. I start with do nothing, okay. And then I go to A. A is not worth doing. I evaluate B. B is less than MARR. Therefore, B is not worth doing. And my recommendation is do nothing. Okay. I go down. A is not worth doing, but the IRR of B, let's say, is 15%, cost of capital is 10%, B is worth doing. Now, going down this approach, A is worth doing. Now, what about if B minus A has a rate of return, let's say, at 8%, and MAR is 10%? Well, that would suggest that the additional money being spent is not worth it. I'm getting a return of 8% less than cost of capital, less than minimum attractive rate of return. That is going down this path. So here, A is worth doing, and here, the incremental is not worth doing. Therefore, A is my recommendation. along this path here, A was worth doing. The incremental return on this, whatever that is, $1,900, is worth doing as well. Greater than 10%, therefore B is worth it. And if I do that, I'm lining up perfectly with the recommendation I'm going to get from net present value, except I'm using a rate of return function. This will give me the projects that have the most value. Okay. So what I'd like to do next day is just do the analysis. We'll talk about this a little bit more. But think about, in terms of this tree, if I tell you the project is mandatory, what part of this tree can you get rid of, and can you reduce your work? Think about this tree in terms of mandatory projects. What can I do?